Sorry, assholes, your quiet day at the office is about to get severely fucked up.
Guys, welcome back to the After Action Review. You know me, I'm Nick Guy, the world's most okayest Green Beret. And as per usual, we're having non-okay people on the podcast. Today we have Stu Steinberg, a OG hitter, and kind of continuing our trend of hearing Vietnam veteran stories, kind of rectifying the wrongs of how we treated an entire generation of warfighters. We thought that this was going to be a great opportunity to hear Vietnam vet stories. So today we have Stu. He's a friend of Sergeant Major Vining, who you guys know from a previous episode, and he kind of continues this great little project we're working on. So Stu, thanks so much for coming on. It means a lot.
My pleasure.
So I just want to kick it off. Let's start from the beginning. You were in the Army from 66 to 70, 71? 71, okay.
Yeah. 5
Gotcha.
years.
Okay, and I just start off from the beginning. How did you end up in the United States Army?
Well, I was at college in New Mexico, and I flunked out. I flunked out because I was in a fraternity, and we were literally Animal House. I discovered Mexico. So we were several of us were going back and forth to Mexico, and I flunked out. So, and that was in like May or June of 66. So I went home to Virginia, and right outside of DC. And a couple of weeks after I got home, I got a letter from my draft board. And at this time, they were drafting people into the Marines. And I knew I did not want to be in the Marines. And so my best friend back then and I went into DC one night, and the drinking age at that time in DC was 18. So, you know, we had our draft cards, and, you know, we had ID and shit. And I mean, we got wrecked. And I tell you the truth, I don't remember anything from the time we went into DC to this bar called the Crazy Horse, and waking up the next morning, passed out in my car in the middle of the Army Navy Country Club on a fairway in their golf course. And I could see where I had driven through the fence. And so we're kind of trying to get our shit together. And way up the fairway, man, we see this golf cart coming. So we decide, well, we need to get out of here. So we did. And we ended up in downtown Alexandria, where they had a Waffle House. And I loved the Waffle House because they made the greatest waffles and these fantastic, and they still do, crispy, really crispy string potatoes. And so we're sitting there eating our breakfast, and I happened to look out the window across the street, and here were all the recruiters. And the Marines, the Army, I think the Navy, Air Force, I think they were all there. And for some reason, we decided we would enlist in the Marines. And because we figured, you know, well, if we enlist, you know, we get to pick an MOS and whatnot. So we went over there, and they were closed. They were out doing a high school presentation, something, I don't know. So we went next door to the Army, and we enlisted. And I let this recruiter, well, both of us, talk us into enlisting to be Night Hercules missile crewmen. And this was one of these deals where this recruiter basically just lied to us about what this job was going to entail. And basically what it ended up being was, you know, pushing the missiles out of the barns, cleaning them with acetone, and with no face masks or anything, inhaling all these fumes. And right when I got close to being in for a year, I decided, man, I got to get the hell out of here. So I went into Homestead Air Force Base, which is where the career counselor was, and told him, I got to do something else. So he looked at me for a minute, and he was looking at my test scores and everything, and he says, well, what would you think about re-enlisting for explosive ordnance disposal? And I said, well, what the hell is that? And he said, well, it's the bomb squad. And I said, why the hell would I want to do that? and he said, well, for one reason, they're going to pay you an extra $55 a month for hazardous duty pay. Now, at the time, I was a PFC, and I was making $90.50 a month. And after taxes and Social Security and all that other shit, I think I was down to about $50. So the $55 for hazardous duty pay, which was tax exempt, was a big seller. That and the fact that he showed me the EOD badge, and I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So I had to re-enlist for another year. You had to have at least 4 years if you were going to EOD. So I did. I re-enlisted. I got a $1,000 bonus. Went home on leave, and then I ended up at Fort Gordon, Georgia, which is where the first phase of EOD school was, chemical and biological weapons. And then eventually to the regular EOD school, which at that time was at the Naval Ordnance Station in Indian Head, Maryland. Everything's at Eglin Air Force Base now. And I made it through school. And it was probably, at that point, I think, you know, one of the greatest accomplishments in my life, because I was a terrible high school student. I mean, I barely graduated. I had a fucking, I don't know, a D+ average or something like that. And yeah, so when they pinned that badge on me at graduation, it was pretty cool.
Man. Well, I feel the same way. I can't believe it. You know, same thing with the Q course. Like, good God, how did I make it? So
Yeah.
I know exactly how you felt. Okay,
Yeah.
so you got the crab on your chest. What year is that?
Early January, first week of January, 67.
Okay, 67. So EOD school is done. Crab on your chest. How did you find yourself in Vietnam?
Well, when I left school, and my buddy Tom Brown and I, we had gone through school together. We got orders for this place called Dugway Proving Grounds, which was out in the desert of Utah, right off the Bonneville Salt Flats. And it was where we designed and tested chemical and biological warfare weapons. And so a lot of what we did had to do with new, mostly chemical weapons that were being developed for use in Vietnam. One of the big ones was the XM40 white phosphorus landmine, which was a really bad weapon. I mean, it was, you stepped on it, a propellant charge blew it up into the air when it exploded at about 8 feet off the ground. and it just fucking killed everything in its path. And I actually ran into them during my first month in Vietnam. So anyway, in March of 1968, an F-4 that was carrying a new type of nerve gas dispenser weapon malfunctioned over a sheep ranch and killed everything that walked, that crawled, that flew. All the sheep were dead. The herders' horses were dead. Their herd dogs were dead. And this was on a Thursday. And for some reason, that was these herders' day off. They were all, I can't remember if they were Armenians or Albanians, but they weren't there when this happened. They were in the town of Tooele at a bar. So anyway, we ended up going in, having to clean this up. It was horrible. It was just horrible. And eventually, these engineers came in with these Rome plows and they dug this huge pit. Everything was scraped into the pit. We piled on thousands and thousands of tires, a couple of thousand gallons of jet fuel, tied it all together with C4 and det caps and det cord, set it off, and after it pretty much burned out, then it was covered, and they put a big fence around it. And as far as I know, this area is still contaminated, and people are not allowed in there. So after we finished this cleanup, that night, me, Tom Brown, Danny Lewertz, Bruce Leibarger, we all went down to the EM Club and got fucking hammered. And the next morning, me, Tom Brown, Bruce Leibarger, Lewertz, Danny had already come down on orders, but the three of us went to personnel, volunteered for Vietnam. I figured, you know, obviously, mistakenly and very stupidly, that, you know, the nerve gas, you couldn't see it, you couldn't hear it, you were just dead. So I just kind of figured that, well, dealing with the Viet Cong and the NVA's got to be better. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. And I ended up in Vietnam on September 8th, 1968.
Man. All right. So again, this is kind of the overarching theme of talking to all these Vietnam vets. It was a clearly different time. In terms of this, you know, I mean, Jesus, nerve gas. I mean, I know everybody signs their treaties. Everybody knows that there are still stockpiles and, you know, whatever, but it never really sees the light of day. That's awful.
Well, for many years, they covered up the Dugway incident.
Really?
Yeah. They said it wasn't because of nerve gas. It was because of insecticide that was sprayed and the wind blew it in. It was just all a total fucking lie.
Wow, that sounds like an awful cover-up. And
there was a great investigative journalist at the Washington Post back then named Jack Anderson. And every year on the anniversary, he always wrote a column about how the government was covering this up and lying about it. And they eventually admitted it and released a whole bunch of documents and shit, either in the late 80s or the early 90s. Man,
all right. That's, well, again, that's
and I think,
terrible.
You know, one of the other reasons I volunteered for Vietnam is because EOD was basically a job that was better suited for combat. And that had a lot to do with why I volunteered for Vietnam and why I extended my tour for another 6 months. So I was actually there a little over 18 months.
Okay. So, all right. So this whole incident, got to get away. don't blame you. That's terrible. You end up in Vietnam. Where do you find yourself?
Well, Tom Brown and I were together. We landed at Benoit, and then we were trucked over to Long Binh, and everyone was standing in this line, and the sergeant, who was basically having people count off or whatever, before he started, he said, "Where's Steinberg and Brown?" And we raised our hands, and he said, "You two guys go stand over there. Your control unit is sending someone to pick you up." And that's what happened. And then I ended up on a Chinook. Tom was on a C-130 going to Cam Bay, and I was on a Chinook with a bunch of guys from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, who I ended up operating with a lot during my first 10 months. So I flew by Chinook from right outside of Saigon to Quy Nhon. And at that time, Quy Nhon was a major port city on the South China Sea. And so I landed there and made a phone call, and someone came and picked me up and took me back to the unit, which was the EOD section of the 184th Ordnance Battalion. Now, the 184th is now an EOD battalion. It's no longer an ammunition battalion. So that's where I ended up.
So you were assigned to the 184th, but you were attached to the 173rd.
No.
Okay.
We had two-man on-site teams.
Okay.
We had one team that was at a place called LZ English outside of the village of Bongsong, which was also on the South China Sea. And English was the home of the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Infantry of the 173rd. And our second two-man on-site team was down south in a place called Tuiwa, where we were supporting the 3rd and 4th Battalions of the 503rd, as well as MACV advisors, Special Forces guys, whatever. And the two-man team in LZ English, we were out most of the time on operations with the 173rd, mostly in a place called the Anlo Valley, which was really, really bad place.
So within this, infantry unit, hey, how exactly were you guys being utilized as EOD techs?
Well, typically what would happen is there'd be a company out on patrol, and they would run into IEDs. We weren't calling them that then. They were, booby traps, mines. And then we would get a radio call from the Tactical Operations Center. They would send a chopper to pick us up and fly us into wherever the ground unit was. And we would take care of whatever there was to take care of. The VC at that time were using a lot of homemade Claymore mines. They were big too. They were like this, a conical kind of a thing. And they would plant them off a trail, and then there'd be a tripwire. So typically what would happen is, we'd go out and we'd be out on point looking for tripwires, and we usually found them. Sometimes we got called out when they would discover a cache, typically in a cave. So we would go in and clear the cave of booby traps, and they were usually booby trapped. And then we had to check, all of the ordnance that was found. RPGs, 4s and 7s, or 3s and 7s, 82 millimeter mortars, 120 millimeter mortars, 122 rockets. So we would clear these caves as best as we could. The problem was that I'm thinking of one incident in particular. We discovered that they had booby trapped these crates of RPG-7s, and there was no way to disarm them. You couldn't get under, these piles of crates. So what we did was we sent back to the rear for maybe 40 pound cratering charges. They were like this long and this big around, and they were full of ammonium nitrate. So we strung them out inside this cave, tied them together with det cord, put about maybe 10 minutes of time fuse, pulled the fuse lighters, hauled ass, got on the chopper, took off, and then we hovered just off the side of this mountain. And when the blast went off, it literally blew the top off this fucking mountain. I mean, we changed.
Jesus.
We changed the environment, and it was a pretty profound experience.
RPG-7s. Anybody listening that spent some time in Iraq, Afghanistan knows an RPG-7. And these cratering charges, though, I mean, was that a tool that like combat engineers were using to clear land, or something? Like just 40 pounds of ammonium nitrate seems like it's an overkill system.
Well, I think the engineers did use them. We used them, like I said, to clear caves, and they were quite something when they went off. Even the single one, which sometimes we used in the middle of a minefield. I remember one case where some villagers had stepped on some bouncing betties that the fucking French had left. And the French, the motherfuckers, didn't mark their minefields, didn't leave any maps or anything. So we got called in and basically got down on our hands and knees with our K-bars, started poking holes in the ground. And after we found about a half a dozen of them, I turned to my teammate and said, fuck this, man, we're not doing this anymore. And I had brought a couple of cratering charges with us on the chopper. So we basically crawled out into the middle of this minefield, set up the cratering charges, put some time fuse on them, hauled ass. And they went off, and there must have been...
I'm sorry, keep talking.
There must have been dozens of these bounding mines. So...
Jesus, I apologize. Sorry about that.
That's
Thought
okay.
I had the battery removed. So, God. Well, again, I mean, that's just you hear about that, and I mean that's kind of a thing of the past. Like guys, on their hands and knees, probing the ground.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. In 2004, one of the teams I was on during my final 4 months, the 287th Ordnance Detachment, I had tracked down all the guys on the team, and we met at Eglin for the EOD memorial services. And shit, I just lost my train of thought.
Probing.
Oh yeah. So after the memorial service, there was a big dinner and dance at one of the big EOD buildings there, and we were sitting at a table with a couple of recent graduates, and they were asking us what it was like, and I said, well, it wasn't like anything like what you guys have. We didn't have robots, and we didn't have bomb suits, and we didn't have bomb carriers. It was two guys in a Jeep and your weapons and your EOD shit. And they were, yeah, they were pretty amazed at that. And
I mean, it's hard not to be. You said that, you know, if you were called out to do a patrol, you guys were on point looking for booby traps and tripwires.
Yep.
Like, so what is the implication there? If you're looking for freaking tripwires, is your eyes are on the ground. So
Yep.
you're leading a patrol. You're not even looking around. You're just looking at the ground.
Yeah, we're relying on the infantry to protect us, and they did.
I don't doubt it, but I'm just saying, like, the idea of like being a point man on patrol and your eyes are on the ground is just so counterintuitive. And that takes massive balls just to be like, you know what, I'm going to take point on this patrol, and by the way, I'm going to do it with blinders. So the only thing I'm seeing is 4 or 5 feet in front of me on the ground. Like, that's insanity.
Well, that's the way it was.
Good God. I mean,
but you never, you know, the truth is, you never really thought about it. I don't think there was ever a time, even after I was wounded, that I actually thought that doing my job would kill me. Of course, it turns out it almost did. But I just, you just didn't think about it. I mean, if you had stopped and thought about, you know, getting hurt or possibly getting killed, I mean, you couldn't have done the job. I mean, it was why they were paying us that extra $55 a month.
Good God.
Yeah. So.
But I mean, well, for $55 a month, I mean, I know it's more than it sounds, but.
Well, now they get I don't know, $350 or maybe $400 a month.
Yeah, they get pro pay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know what it is about EOD guys, because I've worked with Army EOD, I've worked with Navy EOD, and the Navy EOD guys are super cool, and they're super cool, and they got great hair, and they got cool kit. But honestly, the Army EOD guys, I don't know if it's just because they get the mission more so than like the other branches. They understand the ramifications a little bit better, but we had 2 EOD guys, Army EOD guys, attached to the ODA my last deployment, and they were phenomenal. You had a senior and a junior. The senior had been around for a hot minute. Excuse me. Something like 16 years in the Army. Guy's seen it all. E7 type. Real soldier. And the young guy was young. He's super eager to learn. Just happy to be there. And that made for a really good kind of team dynamic having those guys on there. So, I mean, if you're out there and you're saying, hey, you know, I'm going to support this infantry unit, or I'm going to support this ODA, and by the way, I'm just going to take away all my situational awareness. I'm going to take away all the things that are going to keep me alive in combat, and I'm only going to focus on the things that can kill these dudes. That takes a very special type of person. I don't care who you are. I don't care how you cut it. That's the truth. I can't imagine leading a patrol and saying, you know what, I'm just going to totally ignore 95% of my surroundings. I'm only going to focus on where my feet are.
Yeah.
It's insanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I keep losing my train of thought.
That's fine. I mean, there's only two. I mean, there's really only one way to look at your story in Vietnam. It was that of total badassery. I mean, I say that being able to, with all the benefit of removing myself from the horrors of Vietnam and kind of distilling your experiences down to a single word, but that's what it was.
Well, we did consider ourselves badasses, man. I mean,
I'd hope so. You would have to have a chip on your shoulder walking around like that, going, you know what? These guys think they're smarter than us, but watch this.
Yeah. Yep.
So 18 months in Vietnam. That's how long you spent. You extended.
Yeah.
Despite being wounded.
Yep.
You know,
I would have extended a second time, except By that time, I had about 3 years in grade as an E5, and they said I had to go back to the States for nuclear weapons.
Okay, so that was the only way your career was progressing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Man, so all right, so you save you save a bunch of infantry dudes.
I know what I was going to say.
Oh, go ahead, please. Have at it.
I always considered us to be existential doctors.
Why is that?
Because our job was to save lives. And that's what we did. Every time we disarmed something or blew something up, we saved lives, either American lives or Vietnamese lives. A lot of times we were called out, especially during my extension when I was at the 287th, we were on almost daily operations with either 101st Unit or a 3rd Marine Amphibious Force Unit. In fact, where we lived at the Phu Bai Combat Base, we actually lived with 3rd Force Recon. And these were some crazy motherfuckers, I don't mind telling you. And they apparently still are. But we got called out a lot in Northern I Corps, which was basically, you know, butted up against the border with North Vietnam. They ran a lot of airstrikes in that area, particularly in a place called the A Shaw Valley, which is where Khe Sanh was. And anytime they ran a B-52 strike, or even a couple of F-4s or a couple of 105s dropping bombs, there were going to be duds. So a lot of times what would happen is in the after action assessments, you know, they would send in a LRP team, a long range recon team, or maybe an A team, or Navy SEALs, whoever, to do an assessment of the bomb strike. And typically when this happened, they would find duds. There were always going to be duds. And they could be anywhere from a 250 pounder to a 2,000 pounder. It was mostly the Navy that dropped the big ones, the 1,000 pounders and the 2,000 pounders. So we would get called in to destroy these weapons, because if we didn't, the VC and the NVA would come in, they would cut them up, steam out the RDX or the TNT, and turn them into mines. So it was a really important fucking thing that we did, destroying this dropped ordnance. And a lot of times what would happen is we'd set the charges on these things, and then we'd haul ass. And I never put more than 5 or 6 minutes of time fuse on them, because you didn't want the VC or the NVA coming in and, you know, pulling out your blasting caps. So you'd haul ass, get as far away as you could, which in this area, most of these areas in Northern I Corps were really dense forests. It wasn't like the jungles down in the south. And you'd get behind a tree and wait for the damn thing to go off. And in one case, and I talk about this in my book, the thing goes off, and I could hear the base plate from this 2,000 pounder, which probably, the base plate probably weighed 200-300 pounds. And it was what the rear fuse would be screwed into the base plate, and then another fuse screwed into the nose. So we're down behind these trees that have been knocked over by this B-52 strike, and or this air strike, whatever it was. And one of these guys, after the explosion, jumps up, and before I could say, get the fuck down, here comes this base plate roaring down out of the atmosphere. It lands like 5 feet in front of this guy. And if he didn't shit his pants, he should have. Yeah, so that was, and a lot of times what happened is when we went out on these bomb calls, these dropped ordnance calls, we would end up not being able to get extracted, either because of the weather or a lot of enemy activity or whatnot. So a lot of times we ended up hunkered down, you know, with the LRP team or the A team or whoever we were with, MACB advisors, and we would actually then be in the infantry. You know,
Oh yeah.
we took our turns on guard duty, and well, you didn't sleep much anyway. I remember on one call we were on after we did our thing, and the guy that was with me was an E5 who had been in the control team down in Saigon, and Louis Caruso was his name. He's deceased now, unfortunately. Really great guy. And so one day he told the control team, OIC, was a lieutenant colonel, that he wanted to see what it was like, you know, to be with a ground team. So they sent him to us. And one of the chapters in my book is called something like, we did everything we could to kill Louis Caruso. So we blow this bomb, and we can't get extracted. So this LRP team sniper's up in this tree, and Louis kind of standing at the base, and I was over talking to their RTO or something. So the sniper looks down at Louis and says, "Hey, come up here, man." So Louis climbs up in the tree, and he hands him his rifle. He says, "Look through the scope at that ridge over there, and here's this fucking platoon of about 20 NVA looking for us." Because when we set the bomb off, of course, it was like saying, "Oh, we're here."
Yeah, look where we are.
So fortunately, they didn't find us, and we were able to get extracted that morning. But yeah, and Caruso, he was really glad to go back to Saigon.
Did Louis ever go out again after that?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, he wanted more.
He was with us.
Attaboy, Louis. Attaboy.
He was with us for a week, and he went out on some pretty heavy shit.
Man, that's crazy. You guys, real quick, I don't want to interrupt you guys. I really forgot to mention Stu's book. This is what hell looks like. Life as a bomb disposal specialist during the Vietnam War. I 100% meant to mention it at the beginning, but as you guys know, I'm the world's most okayest Green Beret. I'm not a good Green Beret. I'm not even a good podcast host. I'm very mediocre. So, guys, check out his book. It's on Vietnam. My copy's on the way. I'm looking forward to great stories, more great stories like this. But
it's gotten some really good reviews.
It has, and honestly, Star Major Vining, he could not say enough good things about you, about your book.
Well, Mike's a great guy.
He really is. That was a great interview. And it's funny because he's become like this internet legend.
Yeah.
Just due to his appearance, versus what he's done. And
yeah,
I learned a lot about the whole EOD side from Mike. So I mean, yeah. I really appreciate that. So all right, so that was my plug for the book. All right, so all right, Vietnam ended. You go back to school, you become an attorney, but that we don't care about. Attorneys are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
What I do want to know about is your return to Afghanistan. Like, listen, here you go, old school Vietnam hitter. He's been around the block. How do you end up back in Afghanistan in the 2000s?
Well, like I was telling you before we got on the air, one of my best friends, who is a retired major, 23 years as an Army Ranger in Special Forces, was running a narcotics interdiction program in Afghanistan. It was a team of Rangers and a team of SAS guys. And they were basically running interdiction operations along the Iranian border. And they, to be blunt, unlike what we were doing when I was there, they did not take prisoners. When they caught these smugglers and seized the dope, they fucking killed them. And I think that eventually had something to do with why ISAF decided they were no longer going to be involved in interdiction shit. So it was March of 2009, and I knew Tony was over there, and I saw my phone rang, my cell phone, and I looked at it, and it was like 19 numbers, and I said, "What the fuck is this?" So I get on the phone, and it's Tony, and he says, "Dude, I need you to come over here and run the administrative end of this program. He cannot write worth a shit. And he told me that. And he said, I need someone who can write, because there were a lot of reports that were due. And then there was a lot of involvement with ISAF, going to briefings, telling them what we were doing in our program, that kind of stuff. So I talked over with my wife and my son, and they said okay. And in early November 2009, I got on what's the airline? Emirati. I got on an Emirati plane, flew into Dubai, and then eventually flew from there into Kabul. And eventually, what happened was our HQ for our program was at the headquarters for the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, which was located inside a really heavily barricaded and armored location. And so for the first, I don't know, week or so, I was reading lots and lots of stuff about this program and our involvement with the Iranians and the Pakistanis on cross-border interdiction shit. And then one day, the guy who ran all of the counter-narcotics programs, Mark something or another, can't remember his last name. He was a South African. He'd been a commando, whatever they call him in South Africa. So he calls me into his office and says, I want you to go to this ISAF briefing and explain to them what we're doing. So I go, and it was a trip, man. There was a one-star Army general that was running the meeting, and I was sitting next to a two-star general from Romania, and I was the only person in the room that was wearing blue jeans, a t-shirt, and tattoos. And so at one point, they were going around the room, and each person would basically ask a question or say something or whatever. And so here we were, all of these ISAF people, talking about the Afghans, and particularly the Afghan border police, but there were no Afghans in the room, not one. So it gets to this first sergeant. I can't remember who he was with, and he said, looks at this general and says, well, why are we talking about the Afghans when there are no Afghans in this room? And the general looks at him and says, well, we're not ready for that yet. So it got around to me, and I said, well, look, I'm going to tell you guys what we're doing up in Herat, and but I got to tell you, I got to agree with the first sergeant here. I don't understand why none of our country, the Afghan border police guys, why they aren't in here. And the guy that was sitting next to me, this Romanian general, kind of kicked me under the table and then whispers in my ear. He says, well, talk to me when this is over. So eventually the thing was over, and I did talk to this general. It turned out that he was running the school that was training border police command staff, and he actually invited me to come to the school. I never got there because what ended up happening by my second or third week, Tony decided he wanted me on site up at our location in Herat. So I got on a plane, I think a C-130 maybe, and flew into Herat, and then ended up along with my partner, Victor Schmitz, who was ex-KGB, ex-FSB, and ex-Spetsnaz. So we just always believed that he was probably a spook for the Russians. trying to keep track of what we were doing. And but Victor was a great guy. Is a great guy. He may still be over there too. I think he's been there. He's been there like for about 10 or 12 years. He's from the Ukraine. And so what we did was we lived in a fortified position that was near the Herat airport. And what we would do every day is we would drive out to the border police compound, which was about 5 clicks northwest of Herat. And what we did was we taught courses to their NCOs and their command staff. And I taught courses in IEDs, ordnance identification, searches of people, places, and things, and tactical convoy movement. And then what we did was shortly after I went to Herat, Tony had to come back to the States because of some medical issues. So it was just me and Victor. And what we would do is we would get together with our border police guys, and they would get intel about smuggling operations. So we would develop that intel, and then we would plan an interdiction op. And then we went out with them, because, and that was one of the other reasons Tony wanted me to come over there, because the UN had hired these 2 guys. One was a Canadian retired military guy, and the other was a Belgian retired military guy. They would not go on ops. So the border police had no respect for these guys at all. I mean, how do you know if they're doing things the way you taught them if you're not with them? So
fair point.
Yeah. So, and one of the other ways that we developed intel, there was a nomadic tribe in this part of the northwest part of Afghanistan called the Kuchi, Kuchi. And we would go out to their cantonment areas where they had these big tents set up and had their camels and whatever. And we would end up talking with them. Now, I had an interpreter, the driver, really great guy who Tony and I eventually got out of Afghanistan. He now lives in California, where he's managing a 7-Eleven.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I like to hear.
Welcome to America. And so a lot of times, well, what ended up happening is, we would find out from the Kuchi when smugglers were going to be coming through. And one of the reasons that they gave us this intel was we would ask them, the different tribes that we went to, if you could have anything you wanted, what would you want most? And I swear to you, I'm not making this up. You know what they said they wanted most? Better cell phone reception.
Yeah.
Now, in one place, they wanted a well. So what we did was, I can't remember if it was the Italians or the Spaniards came in and put up a cell tower.
Really?
And, yeah. And then in one of the other ones, I think it was the Italians came in and drilled a new well. That fucking thing went down like 2,000 feet before they hit water. And so the Kuchi would give us intel. They would tell us smugglers are going to be coming through such and such an area. And so what we would do is we would go in and we would set up basically an ambush. And typically, I would have 6 gun trucks, Toyota trucks that were up armored. Each one had a RPD 51 machine gun, and 4 guys with AK-47s or RPGs. And what would happen is the smugglers would come in, we would stop them, and they would give up. Because usually it was these young kids that the smugglers were paying $200 or $300 to run a truckload of heroin or opium over the border into Iran. So we did a lot of those, and we never had a problem until the last month that I was there. They tried to bomb my driver and I at least 2 times that we know of. Unfortunately, observant civilians who saw them planting these IEDs in the road that one of the roads that we took, and they had figured out our routes of travel. We had 3 different ways of going, but they apparently knew all of them. The first time, we actually rolled over the device because they weren't after us. They were after the chief of police, who was a huge anti-smuggler, anti-Taliban fucking guy. They hated this guy. They tried to kill him a bunch of times. And then the second time, they planted a mine in the roadway. It was a paved roadway. And some guy that was looking out his window saw them doing it. And when they split, he actually went down the street to an Afghan security force checkpoint and told them. And so they called in the Spaniards, had an EOD team in Herat, and they came in and disarmed this thing. So anyway, my last 2 weeks, I think it was, and I was looking at extending for signing another 90-day contract. We had set up this roadblock, and it was in like this ravine kind of a thing that had 2 ridges, one on each side. So I had 3 gun trucks on top of each ridge, and then we had an up-armored Toyota Land Cruiser, and I had it cross the road, and my interpreter driver and I were behind the Land Cruiser, and here come these guys in this Ford Ranger. So when they get about 100 yards in front of us, I flick on the Klieg lights, and my interpreter's got a bullhorn, and he's basically telling them to, if you've got weapons, throw them down, get out of your rig, and get down on your hands and knees. Well, for whatever reason, these guys decided to open up on us. And so now we're in the middle of this fucking pitched battle, and what was really amazing was watching bullets bounce off the Kevlar on our rig. And eventually, none of these guys were killed, but they were all wounded. So the Spaniards, I called for a dust-off. The Spaniards came in, picked up all the wounded guys, and we seized, I think, 400 or 500 kilos of heroin.
Oh my God.
Well, in the overall scheme of things, it was probably 1/1000th of 1% of all of the heroin. But I always figured that every time we seize these drugs, we save the life of somebody from ODing.
Seriously.
So that's how I looked at it. Now, after this event, I kept waiting for them to call me from HR in Kabul about my new contract. And so when I got down to 3 days, and on the day that your visa expired, you had to be out of the country. So I got back to Kabul, and I was Skyping with my wife, and I told her what had happened. And she and my son asked me not to take another contract and to come home. So I did. In fact, actually, that day, they called me from HR and said, well, your new contract's ready. But I left. Hello.
No, sorry about that.
Hey, no problem.
Connection issue. Yeah. No, that's incredible, man. I mean, honestly. So 40 years later, and you're still in the shit.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
You know, I was 62 years old, and I was definitely one of the oldest guys over there. And it just, you know, when Tony asked me to come over, it just seemed like something I had to do. I didn't think much about, you know, I could get killed doing this, whatever, you know, but it just seemed like the right thing to do.
Well, good God. I mean, after, you know, after service in Vietnam, going 40 years, having a career, having a life, having a family, going back, it's commendable. I mean, honestly, you know, they always say it's you know, it's a bit cliche to say, hey, you can take the guy out of the fight, but you can't take the fight out of the guy. But that's really the case, especially with a guy like you.
Yeah.
Man. Well, Stu, I can't thank you enough. This is an absolute honor and a privilege to hear your story because it is an important story. And like I said, before we started recording, I mean, we have this entire generation of Americans, and we don't know what they did overseas in Vietnam. Just because
I'm really fortunate in that most of the guys that I served with in Vietnam are still alive. And we take care of each other even now. Yeah,
that's you're involved in multiple like veteran organizations, charities, things like that. What are you involved with?
Yeah, I'm on the board of directors of the National Explosive Ordnance Disposal Association. I am the Veterans Benefits Coordinator. I do VA claims for former and current EOD people. I do medical boards. I do physical evaluation boards. And I do a lot of VA work for current and former EOD guys. So I really, I'm really good at it too. And being a lawyer helps because it allows me to, you know, I think understand things about the VA that maybe some other service officers don't.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, you guys, I mean, I can't thank you enough, Stu. You guys, do yourself a favor, get on Amazon and go pick up This Is What Hell Looks Like, Life as a Bomb Disposal Specialist During the Vietnam War by the one and only Stuart Allen Steinberg. Stu, can't thank you enough. This was again, absolute honor and a privilege.
Thanks.
Welcome home, and thank you for your service.
Heavy metal.
Hell yeah. Take it easy, brother.
All right, bro. Talk to you.